So without further ado, we are freaking out excited to introduce our keynote speaker for today's Next in Nature Summit, Corina Newsome.
Hi, everyone. Well, thank you so much. It's an honor to meet the Bug Chicks because I've been seeing their work for a long time, and it's rare to see someone celebrate insects so well and so fully as they do. So that's always so encouraging. I love when people love the unloved animals, and I think we can all appreciate that. So I'm going to go ahead and share with you my screen. I know we say share my screen a lot nowadays. Most people are tired of hearing it, but here we go. We'll go ahead and get started here. Can everyone see this okay? All right. Well, it's such an honor to be here. It's such an honor to be able to speak with a group of incredible young people. I'm always so excited to be able to see what young people are doing and to be able to share any experience that I have to be helpful to the next generation of conservationists, of wildlife enthusiasts. And so today I'm going to be talking, as they said, with you about my journey to the world of conservation, because what I've learned is that when you're a young person considering careers in the future, considering careers, especially when it comes to nature-based or natural science careers, it can be helpful to see what other people's paths have looked like, but also to wrap in my perspective that I have brought to the table as a Black woman and as a woman from the city, from a low-income background. So with that, I'll go ahead and jump right in. So I want to start with this note that I wrote to myself when I was about 4 years old. I had this little notebook that I would journal in, and I said, this is pretty illegible, so I'll read it to you. This is what I want to do when I grow up. I want to be an astronaut and a scientist, and I want to be a scientist on bugs and animals. The astronaut part we can forget about, because the moment I realized I couldn't get on a roller coaster, I knew I couldn't be an astronaut. But when it comes to science, that interest in wildlife and that interest in the outdoors and in nature and in science in general was there from a very young age. And so immediately, from the time I was able to get my hands on resources, I started watching all kinds of science shows, reading all kinds of science books. And these were some of the really awesome science communicators that I was able to be exposed to. So Bill Nye the Science Guy, the Mythbusters, the Crocodile Hunters, and Boomafoo, which was a huge favorite. And then I don't know if any of you will get this reference. It's from Futurama, so maybe too old for you all. But the problem with that, despite the fact that all of these people are phenomenal science communicators, phenomenal scientists, I didn't see myself. So even though they were able to get me really excited about science and get me really interested in the information they were talking about, I did not see a reflection of myself in that field. So I grew up in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in the inner city part of Philadelphia. There wasn't a whole lot of really natural space. And I also grew up in a low-income neighborhood. I grew up without access to a lot of the resources that people maybe would have if they had the money to expose themselves or expose their kids to different careers in the natural sciences. So I was thinking about veterinary medicine, right? Everyone who I knew who liked animals, veterinary medicine was the way to go. But that's only because I had no other ideas about what a person who liked animals and who liked wildlife would do. And so every summer from, I believe, for about 5 years between middle school and high school, I worked every summer at an animal hospital, walked 3 miles a day to get there. But then I had a really lucky encounter. This may look like a stock photo of man with guitar, but this is actually a man named Mr. Mark from my church back home. And he approached me and he said, hey, I heard that you really like animals. Well, my sister works at the zoo. Here's her number, you should call her. When he told me that, I didn't really believe that his sister could help me, his sister who works at the zoo, because I had never heard of a Black wildlife professional. And everyone who I knew who was Black who worked at the zoo typically worked in other departments like concessions or guest services. I'd never seen, which is perfectly fine, but I'd never seen a Black wildlife professional. And so with my teenage angst, I had an attitude. I was like, she's not going to be able to help me. And I even called her and had an attitude on the voicemail. I was a horrible 17-year-old. But that was rooted in the fact that I'd never seen a Black person do that. And on top of that, I had actually a really bad opinion of zoos. I kind of assumed zoos were animal functioned like animal prisons. They were anti-conservation and were contributing to the downfall of species in the wild. But that's all rooted in the fact that I had actually never been to the zoo before. I was 17 years old. I was a senior in high school, and I'd never been there. And that was because it was $20 a person to get in. So I couldn't afford to go to the zoo and really see what it was about. But thankfully, I gave that woman a call, his sister, and it turned out that she was the lead carnivore keeper at the Philadelphia Zoo, which is about the coolest job that you can have as a wildlife professional, especially at a zoo. And she immediately took me under her wing, got me set up with an internship, and that is where my career launched. So my senior year of high school, at the end of the final semester, I completed an internship in environmental and conservation education. So my job was standing around the zoo, talking to guests about the animals they were seeing, and giving them a little bit of a window into zoo conservation, into life at the zoo, and the stories about the species that were facing conservation concern and how the guests could help and contribute to their conservation. And so when I was exposed to the possibilities while I was at the zoo, because not only did I get experience in educating the public, I was also given an opportunity to know what kind of careers there are: zookeepers, educators, nutritional specialists, zoo veterinarians, field biologists, so many people contributing to conservation, and that changed everything for me. So once it was time for me to go to college, I went to a school called Malone University. And because I had been very lucky to get that one experience during my senior year, I was able to know what I had to do to get a career in wildlife sciences, specifically in animal care, because that's what I really enjoyed to do, as well as education. So this is a picture of me in college my freshman year, helping to give medicine to a little sugar glider, which is a flying squirrel from, essentially kind of like a flying squirrel. It's a marsupial from Australia. And so from that internship that I had, I learned that I needed multiple years of animal care experience to get a job. I needed to have experience with a wide diversity of species, and I needed to get experience in outreach education. Also, real quick, if you have a question, and it's really hard for me to kind of see the chat, if you have a question, please just jump in and interrupt me so that I don't miss it. But yeah, please do feel free to unmute yourself and ask any questions you might have. I'll also be taking questions at the end, of course. So while I was in college, I took advantage of every opportunity to get experience. Is someone coming in? Oop. Okay. I took advantage of every opportunity to get hands-on experience. So I worked with everything from mammals to birds to reptiles, such as this, or this is a bird, of course, Senegal parrot. I also was able to participate in education and use the wildlife that I had access to educate the public where I was, which was in Northeast Ohio, actually, about wildlife, and even found an outreach education program with my friend Jake there. At the same time, while I was in college, a really big thing happened. I fell in love with the study of birds, and the study of birds is called ornithology. So during my ornithology class in college, which I was actually not looking forward to because I didn't think birds were that interesting, especially birds in North America, I became obsessed. During the first week of class, I learned about this bird, the blue jay. Blue jays are extremely common birds in Ohio and throughout the eastern United States, but I had never seen one. I was 20 years old, I was in ornithology, I was a wildlife enthusiast, but I had never seen a blue jay. I'd heard of them, never seen one. So the day that I learned about blue jays, learned what they looked like, learned what they sound like, and then I went back outside, I realized they were everywhere. And that is when birds and finding birds and looking for birds, which is called birding, it's a verb, became my life's passion. And that preparation that I did in college did end up paying off. So after I graduated from college, I was able to land what was my dream job in the zoo field, and that was a job of an ambassador animal keeper. And so this picture that you're seeing right now, that animal is called a binturong, or a bear cat, which is a species of mammal found in Southeast Asia, and they're very good at climbing, which is why he's on my shoulders. His name is Wilbur. And so I'm going to walk you through a little bit what life in the world of zookeeping looks like and what that job entails. And it looks different depending on what kinds of animals you're taking care of and what zoo you work at. But generally, there are some common themes when it comes to the work of a zookeeper. Right. There we go. So the three main tenets of my job included animal care, animal training, and education. So this is a picture of me and my team holding a number of our ambassador animals. So ambassador animals at zoos are animals that tend to interface a lot with the general public and to participate in education of the public. And so those are the animals that I was working with. So I'm going to kind of walk you through those three main sections and three main elements of zookeeping, starting with animal care. Now, when it comes to animal care and when it comes to zookeeping in general, what most people think about when they think of zookeepers is cleaning. And that is a really big part of the job, of course, but it's not the whole thing. But cleaning can be a very time-consuming and a very notable part of the job. And so, for example, when caring for large carnivores like clouded leopards, who eat whole prey, right? They're hunters naturally. They leave very unique kinds of messes, ranging from blood to guts to poop, and it can be splattered all over the walls. And so every single morning I would have to go in, or whoever was working with the leopards that day or with any of the animals that day would have to go in and clean up any messes that were made overnight, over the previous day, to make sure that their environment is nice and clean and healthy for them. Animal care also involved tracking the health of the animal. So whether we're talking about large leopards or we're talking about tiny tarantulas, I loved caring for all of the animals that I was working with. And I had the really distinct honor to be able to work with everything from mammals to invertebrates like spiders and cockroaches, bug chicks, I was right there with you, as well as a variety of birds. But this tarantula, whose name is Fuego, Chilean rosehair tarantula, weighed 23 grams, which we recorded every month. And we did the same for all of our animals. And we gave them all physical checkups once a month to make sure that everyone was physically healthy. And if ever there was a problem, we would be able to go to our in-house veterinarians. So this is an American crow who unfortunately sustained an injury in the wild and could not be released because of that injury. And that injury would cause him some pain sometimes. So if we ever noticed that Oliver, the crow, looked like he was in pain, he would get an appointment to get acupuncture. If you've ever heard of acupuncture, that's kind of a treatment we think of being specific to humans, right? But animals can actually get acupuncture, and Oliver actually really enjoyed it. His body would just relax every time he got the acupuncture, and it would very much help to manage the injury that he had sustained in the wild. Now, another big part of the job was raising babies. And to be honest, this is the part that most people enjoy seeing, but it was honestly one of the hardest jobs of a zookeeper, because you're dealing with animals in their most vulnerable stage of life. And the reason why we would ever raise any babies at the zoo is if either the baby themselves were not healthy or were sick in some way and needed medical attention, or if the mother was not able to provide the care that baby needed. And so this first picture is of a tamandua, which is a type of lesser or small anteater native to South America. Most anteaters that we might be used to seeing walk on the ground, but these anteaters climb. This is a baby binturong. So if you remember that large animal that I was holding on my shoulders several slides ago, this is how small they are when they're young. And this is Willow, Wilbur's cousin, being bottle fed one morning. This animal is called a banded palm civet. These are a species of mammal that live in Southeast Asia, kind of in the same region as the binturongs. Very small mammals, but extremely feisty, and they're nocturnal. So caring for them, we would oftentimes have to take these animals home with us because they needed around-the-clock care and around-the-clock feedings. Dealing with nocturnal animals means that you essentially don't get to go to sleep. So that was a pretty tough several weeks caring for them. And then sometimes you get really cool animals. All of these are really cool animals, but one of my favorites was our two-toed sloth named Fern. She was unfortunately orphaned in the wild. And so when she was smaller, we would, even when she's big, we would carry her on our shoulders because sloths like to climb and hang. And so being on our shoulders is the most comfortable position for her. And so you can see the size difference between when she was a young sloth and when she was a full-grown two-toed sloth. Very stinky animals, just as an aside. Now, when it comes to animal training, this was one of the funnest part of the jobs, in my opinion, because you're building trust with animals. So animal training is a really important part of the job, not only for example, getting them used to being around, getting them prepared to be around people, and help us educate the public about their species, but also for taking care of them, right? So what you're seeing right now is a behavior called targeting, which means that when I point that purple stick, that clouded leopard is trained to put her nose on it. So if I need that clouded leopard to move from one place to another, I don't have to chase it around and pick it up, right? That's dangerous and not good. I can just take that target stick, place it somewhere in her enclosure, and she'll go where I need her to go. This is, again, Fern, the two-toed sloth, who I was training to be comfortable on a new perch that was mobile and could be moved around the zoo and to different outreach programs. And then Fester, a turkey vulture, you can't quite see his head, being trained to fly for our animal shows. Now, education is one of the reasons why we would train our animals, and that's because we would educate large groups of people in the public. And so animal shows are one of my favorite parts of the job because we were able to show off the natural behaviors of animals and give people an up-close look, especially at animals that get a bad reputation, like turkey vultures, right? People tend to think of them as bad luck or as disgusting, but they're so important for ecosystem health. So to be able to garner public appreciation for these animals and move people to action on conservation issues was very important, and education was a great tool to use that. And up here, so we have a serval on the top right and a silvery-cheeked hornbill on the bottom left. Now, education also included not just animal shows, but taking these animals out to meet the public on the zoo grounds. So again, Fester was one of my very favorite birds, our turkey vulture, and this is a picture of him kind of spreading out in the sun. It looks like he's giving me a hug, but not a hug. He's just trying to find some sunshine. Or, you know, talking about parrots. Birds, again, are my favorite. So talking about animals like green-winged macaws, such as Elmo here, was great fun for me. But in the middle of my zookeeping, I was a zookeeper for about 4 years, and I realized I started to have a lot of questions that I wanted to answer about the conservation needs of animals, and in particular, birds. I wanted to figure out, because I had come to appreciate birds so much, and I was very conscious of the environmental issues they were facing, I wanted to know, how can we help birds survive in a changing world? And I wanted to answer questions that would help us to contribute to that larger question of how we can help them survive in a changing world. So after 4 years in the zoo field, I decided to leave zookeeping, which was, again, a dream job, which I loved very much, and go to grad school in Georgia, which is actually where I am right now. And so I moved to essentially the southern portion of Georgia by the coast to conduct research on a little bird called the seaside sparrow at Georgia Southern University. So the seaside sparrow, this is one of my favorite pictures of the sparrow. I love when birds do the splits on grass. Seaside sparrows are a bird that lives on the coasts of Georgia, as I mentioned, and they dwell and breed and build their nests in the salt marsh grasses. And when it comes to their environment, they are subjected to some threats. They live in a tidal environment, which means the water level rises and falls twice a day naturally with the tide. But sea level rise, which is an issue caused by climate change, which simply means the sea level is getting higher, is a threat to them. It makes high tides higher than average, which can mean that their nests get flooded more often, which does happen. And unfortunately, when they lose a nest to flooding, which happens sometimes even outside of a sea level rise scenario, they have a behavioral response to that. They will build another nest right away, and they'll build it higher off the ground so they don't get flooded again. But the problem is that when they build their nest higher in the grass, predators can see them a lot more easily. So as sea level rise increases, these opposing threats are expected to intensify. If they raise their nest to avoid flooding, they're met on the other side of that with predation. So what are they supposed to do? So my research focused on the nest predation side of that issue, and I wanted to understand what nest predation looks like across the breeding habitat for the seaside sparrow. All right, so to do that, I used a couple of different kinds of equipment, one of which were camera traps. And camera traps are not traps, they are just video or cameras that are triggered and take a picture whenever anything moves in front of it. So in order to understand what kinds of predators were moving around and living in the marsh, I had camera traps set up throughout the marsh. And so I had little sardine-soaked cotton balls wrapped around some poles. So whenever a predator was walking by and they sniffed it, that camera would take a picture of them. And I'm going to show you some of the really cool pictures I was able to capture on those camera traps. So some of the predators and mammals that I was able to see were animals like the marsh rice rat, which is circled here in yellow. I was able to see animals like American mink, which is super cool. I have to tell you, looking at camera trap pictures was the most exciting part of my job, because it was like Christmas morning every time I was scrolling through the pictures. You never knew what you would see. And other animal species that I saw very often were actually raccoons. Raccoons are very good at adapting and being flexible to operate in all kinds of different environments, including wetlands like salt marshes. And this is actually a mother raccoon with one of her babies. So very, very cute. But I also used video cameras to help me understand nest predation. So I had video cameras that were placed directly on seaside sparrow nests. So if you look at the camera or the picture on the right-hand side, if you look under the camera, you'll see 3 little eggs in a nest. So that camera is monitoring the nest to see which predators are actually finding those nests and eating the offspring of seaside sparrows. So I'm going to show you some of the video footage that I obtained while doing this research. So this is one of the predators, one of what you saw on the camera trap already. Boom, just like that. That is, again, an American mink, and he's going to take the egg out, boom, for a snack. And that's what nest predation looks like. It's very quick oftentimes, and that mink was in and out, got its egg snack, and was on its way. So American mink are a species of mammal, just to give you a little bit of information, found throughout most of the United States, throughout most of North America, and they are carnivores. So they eat other animals, they'll eat insects as well and other invertebrates, and they're opportunistic. So as they're going around looking for food, they will eat anything in their path, essentially. They're also crepuscular, which means that they are most active at dawn and dusk. So usually whenever I would see a mink, it was pretty dark outside. And they're also really skilled at hunting aquatic prey. Their physical adaptations allow them to be very good swimmers and very agile in the water, so they can work on land and hunt in the water as well.
May I ask a question?
Yes.
I'm curious because as a scientist, you look like you seem to have a fascination with the mink, but you're on the side of the sparrow, and it seems as though, you know, there's something going on. Did you have any emotional ties to any winner or loser, or like how did you stay invested in the game but objective? And yeah,
that's a really good question. Yeah, especially when I first started watching these videos and watching seaside sparrow nests get depredated, there were some really gory and kind of sad videos that I had that I would never show people because they can kind of get at your emotions a little bit. There were actually times when I cried, right? I remember seeing a chick that was drowning in a high tide that then got eaten by a fish. I've seen so many things happen, and kind of knowing the threats that seaside sparrows are facing, of course, made me even more, think of, to essentially root for the seaside sparrow, right? Seaside sparrows have no more inherent value or worth than an American mink or any other animal, but because of their decreasing populations and the threats they're facing, that kind of made me want to, root for the seaside sparrow, so to speak. But even just watching predation in general, no matter who I'm rooting for necessarily, can be very sad to watch. So there was definitely an emotional response on my part to watching some of these videos. That's a good question. And oftentimes that is the case for people who kind of work in this kind of realm of science. Now, what the video you're about to see now is predation on an egg, but not from a mammal. This is actually an act of competition and predation. So take a look. So this is a bird, and it's not a seaside sparrow, but watch what it's doing. It is actually poking holes in a seaside sparrow egg and dipping into the hole and eating some of the yolk, right? So there's a couple of things that are going to happen here. Punching holes in the seaside sparrow egg, going in, eating some of the yolk, which makes it a predator now, right? But then it doesn't stop there, okay? Keeps poking holes in the egg, and then watch what it does. It takes the egg completely out of the nest. That little bird is called a marsh wren. Wrens in general are extremely, extremely territorial birds. That means that especially during the breeding season, when they build nests and they have territories that they use for breeding, they don't want any other species, or really even any other wrens, even of the same species, in the area that they've selected. So because of the fact that they fill a very similar niche as the seaside sparrow, meaning that they eat the same things, they nest in the same places, they are competitors. So not only was that marsh wren a predator because it was eating the yolk of the egg, it was trying to take out the seaside sparrow that was in its territory. That's why it took the egg out of the nest. And I have many videos of marsh wrens taking the eggs out of the nest and throwing them overboard to destroy the nest of seaside sparrows because they want those resources all to themselves. But of course, in my work exploring the salt marsh, I was not only able to answer my questions and record videos and take pictures, I was able to see the other life that lived in the salt marsh. So seeing animals like Diamondback Terrapins, ignore my fingernails, it was a rough season that year. Diamondback Terrapins, this was a baby Diamondback Terrapin that had recently hatched. And they use the salt marsh as a way to protect themselves during vulnerable life stages. I also got to see various other species of birds, such as the willet, which builds their nests pretty much on the ground, as well as these nests of clapper rails, which tend to be pretty large. I saw a nest with 11 eggs in it one time, and these eggs are almost the size of chicken eggs, so fairly large. However, I'm going to pivot just a little bit and talk about one thing that I noticed, and I mentioned my identity at the beginning, being a Black person, a Black woman from the inner city, from a low-income background. What I noticed moving through the conservation space, first as a zookeeper working in animal care, and then as a researcher working in the field side of wildlife conservation, was that scientists, we inherently value diversity. We understand diversity to be a very important part of our work when it comes to the natural world. But when it came to the actual scientists who are doing the work, there was very little diversity among those professionals. And so what I brought to the table, my Blackness, being a Black woman, and my background, where I was from, my socioeconomic status, gave me a perspective that I didn't see represented in my field. I was able to see and recognize and call out the inequities that other people weren't paying much attention to because they were not part of the communities that experienced those inequities. So the inequities that I noticed were, one, when it comes to the science field, in which I mentioned previously in this presentation, was that there is not equal access to these careers, right? So if you're from a low-income background, you may not be able to even go to the zoo to figure out what careers exist in wildlife conservation. And oftentimes to get prepared to enter this field, you have to do a lot of free internships, a lot of working for free. And if you're from a low income background, you usually can't afford to do that. On top of that, the lack of representation, children not seeing people like them represented in a field tells them that it's not for them. You know, I never thought consciously to myself as a child, you know what? I'm a Black woman, I'm a Black girl, and I only ever see white men doing this job, so I can't do it. That was never a conscious thought in my mind. I didn't even realize that my mind had been structured to think that way until I was told to call the Black woman who worked at the zoo, and my first thought was, she can't help me. That's when I realized how much these two elements create essentially an exclusion of people, especially people of color and people from low-income backgrounds, in the field of wildlife science. But not only is there inequity in the field of science itself, but even for people who simply want to enjoy the outdoors, not as a profession, but just as a recreation, going outside and exploring and enjoying nature. And so I want to touch a little bit more on this second piece here, the second kind of inequity. This is a picture from Louisiana in a part of the state that's called Cancer Alley. And it's called Cancer Alley because there are just a ton of these refineries and chemical plants that are producing toxins that get into the soil, that get into the water, that get into the air of this environment. As you can see in the foreground of this picture, there's beautiful flowers, grasses, right? There's even some streams and water. But this is in the background, this is in the backyards of people who live in these areas. And overwhelmingly, these people are Black, these people are of color, and they're from low income backgrounds. And so these plants and these chemical plants and these toxifying activities are exposing, again, communities of color and low-income people to the most pollution of any other demographic in the country. So that means what should be a very easy, very healthy, very accessible activity of exploring the outdoors is actually dangerous to their health. It's unhealthy to go fishing. It's unhealthy to use the water. It's unhealthy to breathe the air. And so there are various numbers of inequities that exist in the realm of nature, whether it's nature science or nature enjoyment. And I knew that coming into it, but I didn't see anyone else caring very much about it. And so what I've tried to do now and every day of my life and my career is to share with people that the realm of both natural sciences, if you're a scientist studying nature, or if you're a biologist studying wildlife, or you're an environmental advocate, right? These realms have to be intersectional. And when I say intersectional, I mean that you can't just think about wildlife if you're a wildlife science. You can't just think about trees and nature if you're a nature enthusiast, because guess what? People are a part of nature too. And any decision we make about wildlife, any decision we make about the outdoors is going to impact people, and oftentimes the most vulnerable people who are suffering environmental injustice already. And so I always think about, what does nature have to tell us about the importance of diversity, right? So again, in order to have a really intersectional field that's thinking about not just animals, not just the natural world, but people as well, it's important to have people with diverse perspectives, right? I was the only person oftentimes that brought the perspective that I just shared with you to my spaces. And so I don't want you to take my word for it though. Diversity is important and nature tells us that. So whether you're thinking about, for example, genetics. So I know a lot of you, I don't think very many of you are in college yet, but if you think about genes, right, the code that makes up who we are, our physical bodies, our minds, everything, our genes are very important, for example, for shielding us from certain diseases. So if you think about a group, a population of cheetahs, for example, if you have a population where everyone's genetics are exactly the same, if a disease comes through, it's going to be very likely that they're all they're all sensitive to that disease, and they might all be wiped out. But if a stressor comes along and there's a lot of genetic diversity, the chance that someone in that group will have genes with the answer to that stressor is going to increase. Similarly, if you look at an ecosystem that's full of different kinds of species, different kinds of organisms, if you only had raccoons, right? Raccoons are very important, but if you only had raccoons in an ecosystem, you would not be very well prepared. There would not be the kinds of ecosystem services that we would need for it to stay healthy, right? If you only had raccoons, who would do the pollinating? Who would help plants reproduce? Who would do the decomposing, breaking down organic matter when things die naturally in the ecosystem? So you need a diversity of species to have a healthy working ecosystem. So nature tells us that diversity is important, and we as scientists know that. So I made it a point to diversify the spaces I occupy every chance that I get. And about to wrap up here, but one of the ways that I was able to do that at my most recent zookeeping job was by starting programs that did for others what that one Black woman zookeeper did for me when I was in high school. I was able to start a program that exposed high school students in the Nashville area who were students of color or students from low-income backgrounds to careers in wildlife sciences, focusing on zoo careers. So they got to see what it looks like to be a zookeeper behind the scenes, participate in animal care. They would even get the chance to participate in the education of the public about our ambassador animals and animals they can find in their own backyards. They would participate in keeping track of the health of our animals and even participate in training. And they would also get tours around the zoo to see what other careers existed to broaden their horizons and what they thought was possible and what they knew was possible as potential careers. And then on top of that, they were able to see a Black woman doing this job, which is not something that you very often get to see. So you can do this too. You are all pre-career, awesome science, nature enthusiast leaders. And so you may not be able to start a whole program on your own right now, right? But there are ways that you can think about and invest in being intentional about having as diverse of a community as possible. And so what I want to encourage you to do, even as kids right now, it's important that you build authentic, real relationships with people who are different from you, both now as students in grade school and as you enter your future career. Because whether you're talking about a task force of people who are problem solving in any way, or even just your friend group, having diverse perspectives represented, people from different ethnic backgrounds, different cultures, different socioeconomic status backgrounds, is going to equip your community to be much better at solving the problem and achieving the task at hand. It can be tough, right? we naturally gravitate towards people who are a lot like us, people who we have the most in common with. So if we see someone, or if we're in a group, or we're in an environment and we kind of point out and notice people who we think are a lot like us, we tend to most naturally gravitate towards them. So to reach out and to build relationships and connections with people who are different from us requires us to be very intentional. We have to do that on purpose, because that is not necessarily our natural our natural leanings. And so I would encourage you to be very intentional about that, even diversifying your friend group, because even as individuals, we are better people, and as a community, we are better equipped to solve challenges and address the injustices that exist across spaces, especially in the nature enjoyment and nature science space. We can do that most effectively when all people, all communities are represented in those spaces. So I'll close with this. Nature has a lot to offer all of us, right? It offers us the chance to engage and flex our curiosity, to practice exploration, to dig deep and to ask questions and answer them. Whether we're talking about people doing it for fun, again, as a recreation, or people doing it as their career, as career scientists or animal care specialists, or working in biology in any capacity. Nature also has a lot to tell us. And in many ways, we've thought about that, right? We look to nature to solve a lot of our problems. There's a whole field of science dedicated to that called biomimicry, right? We build things based off of things that nature has already built. We solve problems based on the answers that nature has already provided us. But nature has a lot to tell us about how to interact with other people and how to live in community with one another. So I would very much encourage all of us to listen closely and look closely at the information that nature is sharing with us. And so with that, I will take any questions that you all might have. And so please do feel free to unmute yourself, share any thoughts, ask any questions. I'd be happy to answer. Thank you for listening.
Oh, real quick, thank you so much for that. That was truly inspiring. It was absolutely wonderful. Just round of applause right there. It was really amazing to hear you speak about your life. Again, it was truly inspiring. I already have a couple questions lined up. And how this is going to work is you're going to post your question in the chat, and then I'll call on you to unmute your mic and then ask the question. So here are some of the questions that I already saw. One person was wondering how the acupuncture with the spider actually worked. Like, do you puncture the little thingy, or that was just a very interesting thing that someone had a question about.
Yeah, so the acupuncture was actually with the crow. The spider, the picture from that was just me weighing the spider. But the crow was the one who got the acupuncture. And it works similarly to with people. So there are certain, I'm actually not a super specialist on acupuncture, but there are certain parts of the body where they would put little needles that weren't painful. So they're not painful needles, but they kind of stick into the skin of the crow, and then they send kind of little electrical waves that help to reduce pain. It's typically a very expensive procedure, but we spare no cost for our animals' health. So that's how it works.
Thank you so much. And then another question, I don't see any in the chat just yet, so I'm going to ask another one of my ready questions. What do you think is the most important role of a zookeeper to help these animals?
So one of the, I think, again, the way I think about animal care and conservation in general is that job is intersectional, as I said. So one of the most important roles of the zookeeper, I think, especially nowadays, zookeepers are doing a lot more interaction with the public versus, being more behind the scenes and strictly working with animals. I think one of the most important roles is to connect people with the animals they're caring for, right? So zookeepers, a lot of our specialty is in the care and the science of the animal care itself, but the position that we have gives us the potential to connect people in the general public in a very, very unique way to the plight of endangered and threatened species. And so making that connection and being very intentional about that is one of the most important jobs of a zookeeper. But of course, caring for the animal to the very best of our ability is the most important.
Wonderful, thank you. Another quick question, is nest flooding a climate change indicator?
That's a really good question. So nest flooding has not by itself, particularly for seaside sparrows, been studied, kind of linking it to sea level rise, but it has been studied in other species like salt marsh sparrows. further up north in the Northeast United States. And so yes, that is an indicator of the impacts of climate change. Sea level rise impacts people and wildlife in various ways on the coasts. And that is just one of a myriad of ways that it impacts birds in particular. And so a lot of people have been studying the ways in which populations of birds have been decreasing because they can't survive those really high tides that come from sea level rise, and also come from intensifying storms, really massive hurricanes and massive storms that are bombarding the coast.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And then now we have a question from Barbara. Barbara, if you would like to unmute your mic and ask that question, that would be great. If not, I can totally ask it for you.
I was curious about the sloth that you were working with, because I had learned that they were covered in moths, and I was wondering, when you had to hold it, were you ever afraid, or not afraid, but when you were working with animals, how did you protect yourself from the environments or the ecosystems that their bodies could have been, since they're such foreign animals to our own beings?
Yeah, so the sloth moths that you're talking about, those moths really only exist in the fur of moths in the wild. So there's this there's a whole species of moth that is only found in sloth fur, which is crazy. I actually have a phobia of moths. Sorry, bug chicks. It goes deep. I'm working on it. But I never had to, I never had to interface, thankfully, with the sloth moths. Again, those are really only seen on sloths in the wild. But there were various ways that we did have to protect ourselves from zoonotic diseases, right? So there are certain bacteria that certain animals carry that are not harmful to them, but can be harmful to humans. Or there's a potential for diseases that can be harmful to both people and animals. So we had to be very careful about not transmitting bacteria from one taxa or group of animals like cats to another taxa, like kangaroos, right? So we would disinfect our feet and going in and out of every building. We would wash our hands constantly, moving between animals. And that would protect ourselves as well as the various animals we were working with from possibly getting sick.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So that's interesting that you just say passing zoonotic diseases from cats to kangaroos. I got my start at the Philly Zoo as well, I think long before you. We'll talk.
What?
And I used to work with, camels and elephants and wallabies, but I did the sort of where they brought the animals in and it's sort of like temporary, like the engagement stuff, you know what I'm talking about. So one of my favorite wallabies died of toxoplasmosis because they believe a cat, a feral cat, domestic cat, had tracked it into the zoo. And so that's really interesting. I just connecting that of these zoonotic diseases. But my question is more sort of on a large scale. Do you have hope for the future of nature, conservation, and people?
I actually do. That's a really great question. I'm really glad you asked that because business as usual, right, is not getting us anywhere. And I think that's where people can start to feel a little hopeless, right? It's like we have certain kinds of, we think about conservation in a certain way. We have certain structures and systems in place to address environmental issues, but it seems like it's not really working, right? Well, recently, especially since we've had to problem solve in new and dynamic ways, there is a new understanding that's kind of really surfacing, especially in the realm of wildlife conservation and environmental sustainability and preservation. And it's that oftentimes we conceptualize taking care of and protecting nature as walling off these huge swaths of land that have no people on it, and that's how we do it. That's not going to work. But what we're realizing is that we need to make space and to maximize nature where it exists, even in extremely urbanized places, where places live. The places where people live are places where conservation needs to happen and can happen and does happen. And so as we are really putting to practice understanding that we can't really think of nature as separate from people anymore, because that makes us really ineffective at conserving nature and conserving wildlife. And it also perpetuates not addressing these systemic injustices like I talked about, right? So people are suffering from pollution. People are suffering from, the kinds of toxins in the environment that we're seeing. And so we have to think about people and wildlife and nature together because they are all part of the same system. And so because we're finally realizing that, I am extremely hopeful for the realm of conservation and environmental sustainability, because now people are going to be capitalizing on their, 30-foot by 30-foot yard. People are going to be capitalizing on the spaces that exist in the middle of bustling cities. People are going to be capitalizing on the resources that people have, no matter how big or small it is. And I think that is exactly what we need to be able to adapt and ourselves as people, and to allow species the space to adapt and thrive in a world that is rapidly changing. And then the final thing that I'll add is that because we're understanding how all of these fields intersect and the importance of thinking about people as part of the solution to wildlife conservation, we have so many more minds at work in the problem solving now, so much more creativity than we've ever had before. And so I am extremely hopeful about the future.
Excellent, awesome, thank you. Pierce, do you have anybody else here?
Yes, absolutely. I was wondering if we had a little bit more time, but it looks like we do. We had a question from Tanner, and I was wondering if Tanner, if you want to open up your mic and ask it, that would be great.
Yeah. So you said that you were referred to the zoo by someone at your church, and I'm interested in being involved at my zoo. But since I don't have like the connection that you got, what would be your advice to someone like a senior in high school going as to how to going about getting involved in my local zoo?
That's a great question. So if you don't mind me asking, what is your local zoo?
Cincinnati.
Oh, amazing. I know a lot of people at Cincinnati, so do feel free to reach out to me specifically. I know several keepers there. But one of the best ways, right? So every zoo website, and I know this is the fact for Cincinnati Zoo, on their website, there will be information about ways to volunteer and ways to intern, which are two different things. Interning is usually a very kind of strict, I'm going to be working this number of hours, every week for the whole summer, for the whole fall. It's like seasonal. Volunteering is more flexible typically. Internships get you the most valuable experience, in my opinion. So as a high school student, internships tend to be offered mainly for college age individuals. So if you're kind of going into college, that's usually the earliest you can start with internships. I would double check for Cincinnati, but typically there are options for younger people who are still in high school to get plugged in. And those are usually in volunteer opportunities. And sometimes they even have programs like zoo camps or learning experiences, experiential learning opportunities for younger people that aren't necessarily internships, but they do exist. So I would encourage you to look at the Cincinnati Zoo website and check out, what the age requirements are, what the other requirements might be for getting into those programs. And then I would be happy to, I don't know how old you are, Tanner, but I'd be happy to connect you with one of the keepers who I went to school with, who also works at the Cincinnati Zoo, and she also works actually with ambassador animals. And so I'd be happy to help build that bridge as well.
Okay, thank you.
I think we have time for one last question. I know Cayenne Butler has a really good question, and if you want to open up your mic, that would be great.
Yes, hi, I'm sorry. My mic wasn't working. I was just so moved by your presentation, first of all. And I just want to know, as a teacher, how can I promote awareness? I teach in a very diverse population. I have students that have never been to a zoo. They don't have the connection. How do I help them fall in love with this and want to do something about it?
That's a great question, Cayenne. Thank you for that. I think there are lots of different, depending on your specific community, right? And depending on the resources that exist in your city or in your region, this can look different. But one of the first ways that I would say, if you're a teacher and you're an educator, I remember growing up in all of my classes and in my textbooks and in the presentations I saw, whenever I saw a scientist, they were always white. They were always usually white men as well. And it wasn't even until recently that I started seeing people of color and Black people represented in textbooks and represented in presentations about scientists. And that actually makes a difference for me as a scientist. I'm already, in the field, and it makes a difference for me. So I would encourage people to, even when you're depicting images to students, to try and find as many diverse faces as you can that represent the diversity of the room, the class that you're teaching. When it comes to exposure and access, can I ask Cayenne where you are in the world?
Yes, I'm in Houston, Texas.
Houston, oh, yes, there's so much in Houston. So, for example, I currently, actually, I didn't get into this because I didn't have enough time, but I currently work at Georgia Audubon. So I work for the Audubon Society, which works to conserve birds and connect people to birds, et cetera. Houston Audubon is an absolutely phenomenal organization that does a lot of community work to get people exploring in the outdoors and even helping to collect data. So getting people practicing collecting data about birds and nature outside in the middle of the city. So I would be absolutely thrilled to connect you with my contacts at Houston Audubon, because if you're, you know, what I've noticed is that if you're a teacher and you're, you know, not really, your field of specialty is not necessarily wildlife conservation, right? It may be a little bit like a black box to figure out how do you enter that? How do you introduce students to that? But because I've had the privilege of being able to kind of be on that side, I want to use my connections in as many ways as possible. So I will connect you. If you wouldn't mind sending me, I'll put my email in the chat. How about this? I'm going to put my email in the chat. Everyone in the meeting, corina.newsome@georgiaaudubon.org. There we go. The best way to do it is that a lot of these conservation organizations, both zoos as well as organizations like Audubon societies, are looking for ways to plug in and offer exposure opportunities for students, both for career and for, you know, outdoor exploration. But it's not always super well advertised. So I would encourage you to check out Houston Audubon and check out Houston Zoo and what they're offering. But I will also go ahead, if you wouldn't mind emailing me, Cayenne, and Tanner, and I would be happy to connect you with the people who work there.
Well, again, thank you so much for speaking. It has truly been an honor to have you speak today, and it was so inspiring to, I think, a lot of us and all of us. But thank you so much again.
Thank you. It's been an honor to be here. It's great to meet all of you. And again, if you ever have any questions, do feel free to reach out with them. I'd be happy to help offer any experience that would be valuable to you all.